Maybe you clicked out of curiosity, or maybe you were looking, without knowing, for a quieter place, where words move slowly and even silence has its place. I wrote this story gently, like stitching together memories, pain, and small discoveries, hoping that, at some point, you might see a piece of yourself here. If that happens, even for a moment, stay. Listen as far as you'd like. And if you feel like leaving a sign, maybe a simple "I'm here" in the comments, know that it means more than you think. If you find comfort in this space, you're always welcome to share it, or just subscribe and come back when you need another quiet corner. It was close to midnight, one of those nights when the rain doesn't fall straight. It whips across the highway like sheets of glass. I was sitting in my cruiser off I-95, finishing up paperwork, when dispatch called in a pileup involving a jackknifed semi. I headed there fast. When I arrived, the scene was chaos. Emergency lights bouncing off wet pavement, smoke hanging low. A sedan had gone off into a ditch and caught fire. Firefighters were already battling the flames. I started walking the perimeter, checking for anything that could identify the driver. That's when I found it. A leather wallet, soaked but intact, lying a few feet from the burning car. Inside was a driver's license. Elise Connors, age 24. Normally, that would have been enough to start the grim paperwork. But something didn't add up. The body in the burned car was impossible to identify, too badly charred, and the wallet felt almost too convenient, sitting right there in the open. Call it a cop's instinct, but I didn't buy it. 6 hours later, my gut was proven right. At a small rural hospital 20 miles out, a nurse waved me over. "Officer Graves, you'll want to see this." There she was, Elise herself, bruised and groggy, but alive. She had apparently been pulled from another wrecked car further down the ditch, unconscious but breathing. When she opened her eyes, the first thing I told her was, "You're lucky. You survived a crash most people wouldn't walk away from." But the relief on her face didn't last. I explained the mix-up, how her ID was found by the wrong vehicle, how her parents had already been notified. She blinked at me, disbelieving. "So, they think I'm dead?" I hesitated, then gave her the part that unsettled even me. "Not only that, they've already filed the insurance claim." Within hours, the look on her face wasn't just shock. It was betrayal, raw and cutting. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a crash on a rainy highway. This was about a family who, instead of checking if their daughter was still breathing, decided she was worth more dead than alive. And I had a feeling the storm that night was nothing compared to what was coming next. Back at the hospital, Elise was still hooked up to monitors, her voice rough from the oxygen mask. I remember sitting in that plastic chair by her bed, just listening. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry in the way I expected. She sounded tired. "They've been waiting for this," she said quietly, staring at the ceiling. "I was never supposed to exist. My mom calls me her accident baby. My dad doesn't bother with words, he just ignored me. But Caleb? Caleb was the golden child. Piano lessons, private tutors, the college fund, everything." She told me about waiting for rides home from school that never came, standing in the rain while her parents forgot, or maybe just didn't care. She told me about saving up for a school trip only to have the money taken at the last minute because, as her father put it, "Your brother needs it more." The more she talked, the clearer it became. This crash hadn't just been an accident to her family. It was an opportunity. She was the unwanted expense, and Caleb was the investment they'd protect at all costs. I found myself gripping the arms of the chair tighter than I should have, because while Elise spoke, I couldn't help thinking of my own sister. She didn't survive her parents' neglect. Different details, same kind of cruelty. The kind that decides which child is worth saving and which one isn't. That night, I realized this wasn't just another case on my shift. I wasn't just the cop who happened to find her alive. Whether I liked it or not, I was already pulled into her story. And Elise, this so-called invisible daughter, was about to find out just how visible she could become. The morning after she woke up, I expected Elise to ask me to call her parents, to let them know she was alive, to demand answers. Instead, she surprised me. "I don't want you to report me just yet," she said, her voice steadier than I'd heard it the night before. I frowned. "Elise, they think you're dead. If I don't clear this up, we're talking about insurance fraud, false reports. This could get messy real fast." Her eyes didn't flinch. "That's exactly why I want to wait. I need to see what they do when they think I'm gone. I want to hear what they say at my funeral." I shook my head at first. It went against everything I knew as a cop. You don't play games with official death records. But I also remembered what she'd told me about being the accident baby, about standing in the rain while her family poured every ounce of attention into Caleb. I remembered my own sister and how silence had cost her more than she deserved. So I compromised. 72 hours. That's it. You stay off the grid. No calls, no social media, no contact. I'll keep the report sealed for now, but after that, this ends. She nodded like she'd already made peace with it. That evening, I drove her out to my cabin near Lake Mason. No cell service, no neighbors, just pine trees and the sound of water hitting the dock. Elise barely spoke on the ride out. She sat in the passenger seat like a shadow, watching the rain streak down the window. For the next 2 days, she moved through that cabin like she wasn't sure if she was alive or not. She cooked simple meals, sat on the porch with a blanket, and kept a notebook where she scribbled thoughts she didn't share. Sometimes I caught her staring at the fireplace, like she was rehearsing the words she might say when the time finally came to step back into her own life. It struck me that Elise wasn't just hiding. She was preparing, like someone rehearsing for a role she'd been forced into her whole life but never wanted. She called it her rebirth. I just called it dangerous. But deep down, I knew there was no stopping her. Because once you've spent your life invisible, maybe the only way to really be seen is to walk into your own funeral. On the third morning, I drove into town to pick up some supplies. At the diner near the courthouse, I spotted a stack of folded programs sitting by the coffee counter. Funeral announcements. The name on the front hit me like a gut punch. Elise Connors. I grabbed one and brought it back to the cabin. Elise was sitting at the kitchen table when I laid it in front of her. She didn't open it right away, just stared at her name printed in bold letters like it belonged to someone else. Finally, she unfolded it. On the cover was a photo from her middle school science fair. Awkward braces, holding up a trophy, eyes squinting under the fluorescent lights. Underneath, in cursive. She tried, but never quite enough. Her jaw tightened. She didn't cry. She didn't even curse. She just closed the program and pushed it aside like it was a bill she'd already decided not to pay. "That's them," she said flatly. "Even when they pretend to mourn me, they can't help reminding the world I was never good enough." I wanted to tell her to forget it, to focus on staying alive instead of proving a point. But then I pulled out the real punch in the gut. The insurance report I'd managed to confirm through a contact at the county office. Her parents had filed their claim less than 24 hours after the crash. No waiting, no verification, just signatures and a payout request for a 7-figure policy. I slid the file across the table. "They didn't hesitate," I said. Elise looked at the paperwork for a long time before answering. "Good. Let them dig their own hole." The more they show their true faces, the less I have to say when the time comes." There was no fury in her voice, just a cold determination. For the first time, I realized she wasn't just planning to walk into that church to shock her parents. She was planning to expose them, to make sure the whole world saw what she had lived through. And judging by how quickly they'd turned her death into a payday, I knew she wouldn't have to work hard. They were already doing half the job themselves. The church was packed that Sunday morning. From the back pew where I sat, I could see the casket up front, closed, of course, because there was no body to show. Just a polished wooden box standing in for a daughter they'd already cashed out on. Elise wasn't with me. She'd slipped in through a side entrance and stayed out of sight. My job was simple: watch, record, and wait for the right moment. I carried a small audio recorder in my pocket, thumb ready on the button. Her parents were front and center. Marlene wore a navy dress and clutched tissues like they were stage props. Charles kept a solemn hand on her shoulder, shaking his head slowly as if grief itself had weight. To anyone else in that room, they looked like the picture of devastated parents. To me, it was theater. Then Caleb stood to speak. He was dressed in a sharp suit, the kind of outfit meant for LinkedIn photos and promotion interviews. His voice carried easily through the church. My sister always struggled. She was fragile, weaker than most. But she had a good heart. Now it's my turn to carry the family forward, to honor her by living the life she couldn't. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the pews. Some nodded, others dabbed at their eyes. I caught a woman whispering, "At least they still have Caleb." From where I sat, the hypocrisy burned. Caleb wasn't mourning. He was positioning himself, polishing his image while standing on his sister's supposed grave. I clicked the recorder on, catching every word. My pulse thudded louder with each speech, each lie that painted Elise as some fragile afterthought. At that moment, I wasn't thinking like a cop anymore. I was thinking like someone waiting for the storm to break. Because Elise wasn't gone. She was here, in this very building, listening to the family that had written her off. And sooner or later, she was going to walk down that aisle and prove them all wrong. From the back row, I kept my eyes on the casket while the service dragged on. Hymns, prayers, the kind of scripted comfort people cling to when death feels real. Except here, the only real thing was the fraud. Elise hadn't shown herself yet. She was standing near the side entrance, half hidden behind the heavy wooden door. From where I sat, I could see just enough. The black slacks, the white blouse, her face unreadable in the dim light. She wasn't ready to move. She was listening, and she heard everything. Charles, her father, finally took the podium. He looked out at the crowd, hands clasped, his tone heavy but rehearsed. "It's been hard," he began, "but maybe this is God's way of lifting a burden. After years of struggle, we can finally move forward." The words slipped before he caught himself. A burden. My stomach dropped. I saw Elise stiffen, her hand tightening on the pew by the door. Then she moved. No dramatic shout, no storming entrance, just steady steps down the aisle. People turned one by one, whispers turning into gasps. I swear, you could feel the air sucked out of the room. Caleb froze in place. Marlene's tissue dropped from her hand. Charles went pale, then red. The congregation sat paralyzed, watching a young woman they thought was buried walk straight toward the casket meant to hold her. It felt unreal, even to me, and I knew she was alive. I remember thinking, this is what it must look like when the dead rise. Charles finally broke the silence. Not joy, not even shock, just irritation, like someone had ruined his afternoon. His voice came low but sharp enough to cut glass. You were supposed to be dead. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, a woman fainting in the second pew. Elise didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eyes. That was when I slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed record. Because this wasn't grief anymore. This was the mask slipping. And now, everyone in that church was about to hear who they really were. The moment Charles spat out those words, "You were supposed to be dead," it was like pulling a fire alarm. People didn't know whether to scream, run, or just sit frozen in their pews. I didn't wait. I stood up, pulled out my badge, and announced myself. The uniformed officers I'd asked to be on standby came in through the side doors. Within seconds, the whispers turned into a stunned silence as they moved down the aisle. Marlene clutched her husband's arm, insisting through tears, "This isn't what it looks like." But the mask was gone. Charles didn't bother pretending anymore. He just glared at Elise like she had ruined the best deal of his life. The cuffs clicked shut, first on him, then on her. Caleb, standing a few feet away, raised his hands like he was at gunpoint. "I didn't do anything," he stammered. "I wasn't part of this. I didn't know." Elise finally spoke, her voice steady enough for the whole church to hear. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because the truth matters. You buried an empty box, and you buried me with it. Not anymore." No celebration, no tears, just cold clarity. Outside, the press was already waiting. Somehow word had leaked. A daughter declared dead walking into her own funeral isn't exactly a story that stays quiet. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, reporters shouting questions that no one was ready to answer. By that evening, the headlines were everywhere. Daughter walks into her own funeral. Parents arrested for insurance fraud. I'd been in law enforcement for a while, but I'd never seen anything like it. Elise, who had spent her whole life as the invisible daughter, was suddenly the face on every screen, the name on every headline. And as much as this looked like the end of the story, I knew it was only the beginning. The trial started 3 months later, and by then, the media had already turned Elise into a headline. The girl who walked into her own funeral. Every news anchor said it with the same mixture of shock and fascination. But in the courtroom, there were no headlines, just cold, fluorescent lights, and 12 jurors waiting to hear the truth. I was called as one of the first witnesses. The prosecutor asked me to describe what I saw at the church. The tears, the trembling voices, the way Charles and Marlene had played the part of grieving parents. I told the jury what I'd written in my notes. They weren't grieving. They were performing. Then came the evidence Elise had collected with my help. Screenshots of emails, messages between her father and Caleb. One line in particular froze the courtroom. "Looks like her death is our lucky break." The words had come from Caleb's phone. He sat at the defense table, shifting in his seat, eyes darting anywhere but toward his sister. Charles was brought to the stand. When asked why he never verified his daughter's death before filing for $1 million payout, he didn't even blink. His answer was flat, almost bored. She was always going to fail. We just made peace with it sooner. The jurors didn't need coaching. I saw the disgust ripple across their faces. Then it was Marlene's turn. She tried for the sympathetic angle, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, speaking in a trembling voice about how they had been misled by circumstances. She claimed they filed the insurance paperwork in shock. But the prosecutor was ready. He clicked a screen and projected one of her Facebook posts, dated 2 hours after she'd signed the claim. "God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes you have to let go to move forward. Caleb will carry our family now." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge's expression hardened. For Elise, sitting just a few feet away. This wasn't vindication yet. I could see it in her face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was waiting. Waiting for the world to finally understand what it meant to be the daughter who was never supposed to count. And for the first time, the lies her parents had spun for decades weren't just unraveling. They were being read into the record, line by line, for everyone to hear. The verdict came faster than I expected. Charles and Marlene were both convicted: insurance fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, 5 years each. The judge's words were clinical, but the weight of them settled heavy across the courtroom. For the first time, Elise's parents weren't just cruel people behind closed doors. They were criminals in the eyes of the law. Caleb, though, he walked out without cuffs. Technically, he hadn't signed anything. His texts were cruel, sure, but not enough for a conviction. The jury let him go. I watched him leave the courthouse with his shoulders hunched, his phone already buzzing with calls that he didn't take. He was free, but not really. By the next week, his employer cut ties. His fiancée called off their engagement, and his name was dragged through every headline. Elise didn't celebrate. She didn't throw her victory in their faces. Instead, she got to work. Within a year, she'd published a memoir, Buried Alive: How My Parents Tried to Cash Me In. It hit bestseller lists, not because of scandal alone, but because her voice was clear, sharp, and painfully honest. The royalties went straight into something bigger: her nonprofit, the Phoenix Foundation. Its mission was simple: support kids discarded by their families, kids who'd been told they were mistakes, the same kind of kids Elise used to be. Still, the shadows lingered. Every few months, Caleb would send another email or letter. Sometimes it was full of blame, other times just one line: "You ruined us." Elise never answered, but I knew she read them. The past doesn't vanish just because a judge slams down a gavel. Watching her rebuild, I came to understand something myself. Justice isn't about perfect endings or neat punishments. It's not about feeling like the scoreboard is even. Justice is when the truth refuses to stay buried. And that's what Elise had: her life, her story, her voice. The rest, as I'd learned long ago, is never quite finished. A year after the trial, Elise invited me to the opening of her foundation's first community center. It was a modest brick building on the edge of town. Nothing flashy, no marble plaques or polished speeches. But when I walked inside, it felt alive. The lobby was full of kids and teenagers, some with foster parents, some with caseworkers, some who just needed a safe place to land. They were painting a mural on the far wall: a woman with wings of fire rising out of ashes, a phoenix taking flight. Underneath, in bold letters, it read, "You are not disposable."